The United States and Canada are supposed to be best friends. They're not. They're two countries that spent 250 years refusing to become one. In August 2026, trade talks collapsed. Washington slapped 50% tariffs on Canadian goods, and Prime Minister Mark Carney matched them dollar for dollar. Then the president revived his pitch. Canada should be the 50% force state. Except it was never a joke. In 1775 and 1812, American armies invaded. Both times they failed. So here's the question. Why does this country keep saying no to its giant neighbor? Part of the answer is that Canada started long before anyone tried to conquer it. When the last ice age released its grip, people moved into this land and never left. Indigenous peoples have lived here for at least 12,000 years, farming in the south, hunting across the frozen north, and building trading networks that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Nations rose and fell, made alliances, and fought wars, all of it on a continent that was already someone's home. They built longhouses on the Great Lakes, carved totems on the Pacific coast, and hunted caribou on the tundra. When Europeans finally arrived, they were late. The first visitors were Norse sailors, who crossed the North Atlantic and built a tiny settlement in Newfoundland around the year 1000. It lasted a few decades and then vanished. For 500 years, that was the whole European story of Canada, a campfire that went out. Then came a Frenchman named Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, he founded Quebec on a cliff above the St. Lawrence River, at the narrowest point where a ship could be stopped. Champlain wasn't digging for gold. He was chasing beaver. In Europe, beaver fur made the best hats, and the trade was worth a fortune. But here's the catch. You can't trap enough beaver with a handful of Frenchmen in a forest the size of a continent. So the French built the fur trade on partnership. Champlain allied with the Huron and Algonquin nations. French traders married into indigenous families, learned the languages, and lived the winters. This wasn't charity. It was the smartest business model on the continent. An alliance network that put French goods into indigenous hands and furs into French ships. If you've ever wondered why Quebec still speaks French, this is the moment it started. But New France had one fatal weakness. People. By 1760, fewer than 60,000 French settlers lived in all of Canada. The British colonies to the south had 1.5 million. That gap decided everything. In 1759, during the 7 Years' War, a British fleet sailed up the St. Lawrence under cover of night. General Wolfe's soldiers climbed a cliff everyone said was impossible, and at dawn they stood on the Plains of Abraham, just outside Quebec. The battle lasted about 15 minutes. Both generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, died on that field, and with that, French Canada belonged to Britain. 4 years later, France signs it away for good, keeping its sugar islands in the Caribbean instead. Voltaire reportedly shrugged at the whole frozen territory, calling it a few acres of snow. For 12 years, the Canadians, most of them French, speaking and now ruled by a British king, tried to figure out what that meant. They didn't have long. In 1775, the American Revolution exploded to the south, and the Continental Congress made a decision that history mostly forgets. They invaded Canada. American soldiers marched north to liberate the colony and bring it into the deep revolution. One army took Montreal, another led by Benedict Arnold, hacked through hundreds of miles of Maine wilderness in winter, losing half its men to cold and starvation before it even reached the fight. On New Year's Eve, in a howling blizzard, the two American forces stormed Quebec City together. They were beaten back in hours. The general leading the attack was shot dead in the snow. Arnold was wounded in the leg and carried away. Canada stayed out of the revolution. Here's the twist nobody expects. The American Revolution didn't just fail to conquer Canada, it created it. When the war ended, tens of thousands of American colonists who had stayed loyal to the king packed up and walked north. They settled in Nova Scotia and along the St. Lawrence, and they brought a ferocious commitment to the British Crown, the very thing the new United States had rejected. Canada's founding population wasn't rebels. It was the people who refused to rebel. That refusal, that wind, is baked into this country's identity. 30 years later, America tried again. The War of 1812 started because Britain was seizing American sailors and arming indigenous nations on the frontier. But it quickly became something else, a second invasion of Canada, sold as the chance to finally push the British out of North America. American generals expected a walk. Thomas Jefferson reportedly said taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. It wasn't. In October 1812, at Queenston Heights, Canadian militia and British regulars threw back an American invasion force at the cost of their own commander, Isaac Brock. The next year, American troops burned York, the capital of Upper Canada, to the ground. Britain's answer was to sail to Washington and burn the White House. Through it all, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh led a confederacy of indigenous warriors fighting beside the Canadians, and he died in battle in 1813. The war was messy, with victories on both sides, but one thing stayed true: Canada was never conquered. When the war ended in 2015, the border sat exactly where it had been before a single shot was fired. No territory changed hands, but something else changed forever. Canadians had fought off the United States twice, and they knew it. The border stopped being a line on a map. It became a wall built from two wars. And the United States, having failed twice, never invaded again. But the real fight wasn't with America. It was inside the colony. By the 1832s, Canadians were furious that a handful of British-appointed officials ran everything while elected assemblies could only argue. In 1837, rebellions broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada. They were crushed quickly, but they forced Britain to ask a dangerous question: how do you rule a colony that won't stop arguing? The answer became Canada's quiet superpower. Britain handed over real power, letting the colony run its own affairs while keeping the Queen. By 1848, Canada's leaders answered to an elected parliament, not to London. No war, no revolution. Just a door opened a crack, then wider. Over 50 years of arguing. The next challenge came without guns. It came with politics. After the American Civil War, the United States stood with a huge standing army and loud voices calling for the annexation of British North America. Irish, American war veterans, the Fenians, staged raids across the border. Britain, tired and distracted, quietly told its North American colonies to learn to look after themselves. So in 1867, 4 British colonies, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, joined into a new country called the Dominion of Canada. The men who made it happen, John A. Macdonald and George Etienne Cartier, one a Scottish-born lawyer, the other a French-Canadian statesman, didn't overthrow a king. They united to survive next to a giant. Confederation was Canada's answer to the question the Revolution had asked 90 years earlier. Now, the new country had to hold itself together, and its solution was a railroad. Between 1881 and 1885, crews blasted and laid the Canadian Pacific Railway across the continent, a line of steel that tied British Columbia to the east. It was built largely by Chinese laborers, paid less and treated worse than other workers, in conditions that killed thousands. The railroad did its job. It made Canada one country from ocean to ocean. But it was built on a human cost the country is still accounting for, and the accounting goes deeper. From the 1882 onward, Canada forced Indigenous children into residential schools run by churches and the state, designed to strip them of their languages and their families. For over a century, about 150,000 children passed through those schools. Thousands died in them. In 2021, unmarked graves of children were found at former school sites, and the country had to face what had been done. This is the other story of Canadian independence, a country that survived its neighbor by deciding who belonged and who didn't. The 20th century turned that colony into a nation. The moment everyone points to is Vimy Ridge. On Easter Monday, 1917, on a hill in France, all 4 Canadian divisions attacked together for the first time and took a position the British and French had failed to take. Nearly 3,600 Canadians died that morning. But when the war was over, Canada had something new: a reputation and the right to act like a country. Canada signed its own peace treaty. In the Second World War, Canadian troops stormed Juno Beach on B-Day and helped liberate the Netherlands. And in 1982, Canada finally brought its constitution home from Britain. After the war, millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and later from every continent, and Canada rebuilt itself as a country where nearly everyone's family came from somewhere else. That mix, not any single bloodline, is what the country calls its identity. The deepest question, though, wasn't about Britain at all. It was whether Canada could hold together. In 1971, Canada became the first country in the world to make multiculturalism official policy. Not a melting pot, but a patchwork quilt held together on purpose. The test came at Quebec, the French-speaking heart of the country. Quebec voted to stay in Canada in 1980, and again in 1995, the second time by fewer than 5,000 votes. Half the country watched one referendum decide whether the map would split in two. It didn't, but the scare changed everything. Every leader since has governed knowing that this country exists only as long as it's chosen. Which brings us back to 2026. In August, trade talks collapsed again. Washington raised tariffs on Canadian autos and steel to 50%, and Mark Carney matched every dollar. Carney, the Prime Minister, was a former central banker who had steered the Bank of Canada through the 2008 crash and run the Bank of England. Then the American president went back to the old line. Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one. Same argument, same pressure, coming around like it has every generation for 250 years. The tools have changed, from muskets to tariffs, but the offer has not. Give up the country, and the problem goes away. And once again, Canada's answer was the answer it has always given: no. So why has this border held? Not because of geography alone. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and about 42 million people live there, most of them within 100 miles of the United States. The two countries share the longest undefended border in the world. No walls, no armies, and no union either. That's the strange thing about this border. The two countries never needed to be friends, and they never needed to be enemies. They just had to stay two countries. The border held because independence was never a gift. It was a choice, made over and over. By colonists who refused to join a revolution, by militia who fought of an army, by a tiny country that built a railroad to hold itself together, by a generation that faced its own failures and chose a different Canada. Borders, it turns out, aren't drawn once. They're redrawn every time a people decides who they are. For 250 years, whenever America asked, Canada answered the same way. That answer is the entire history of this country. Do you think that border holds best when it's a wall or when it's a door? Tell us in the comments. And if this is the first time you've watched the channel, hit like and subscribe, because we tell the whole story of one country every week. Next time, we're heading somewhere with a very different answer to the same question.